Do you feel architecture? The psychologist William James once suggested that it is through our body that we perceive, and because our body is the background of our everyday action, it is always there, it is fundamental in perceiving the environment. The question is then, is it maybe possible that we perceive architecture in the same way as we perceive our body, or as we integrate our body in the brain? So one of my colleagues, a neuropsychologist, he said, well, that while the body is always the same, architecture is always changing. So the question is, how do we formulate a hypothesis for neuroscience in which we can really consider this aspect of architecture and finally also better find out what architecture is and what it can do? What I present you today is are some behavioral studies that I have done together with the Laboratory of Cognitive Neuroscience on the way to elaborate such a hypothesis. So it is particularly focused on behaviors that we developed and how to measure these behaviors in order to understand what the neural mechanisms are and where to measure and how to interpret the data. Embodiment is a very ancient idea, as we have heard many different times, and it's about projecting the human body into physical matter and geometry, as illustrated, for instance, by Leonardo da Vinci or also by Giorgio Martini in the Vitruvian Man. It's a recurrent figure which has been drawn many times. It's a very important paradigm of the Renaissance. In my own work as an architect, as a designer, I use this principle very much to project myself into the landscape and into the environment and to imagine spaces in which I can feel at home or for which I can develop some sort of identity and I can feel safe. And these spaces, of course, have to be spaces to meet people, spaces of coexistence. This is for me, one of the most important aspects of architecture. But architecture is not only physical matter, it's a virtual space. So what is physical is truly the separation between public and private, so therefore also this very important aspect of cohabitation. On the other hand, we could also simulate, this is one of the crucial aspects here through perspective, we can project ourselves into our future. And the question is, which is very important if we want to develop a more sustainable approach to the environment, is how do we make this future tangible? How can we understand the way it feels to really be in this space, and how can we improve the space and improve the well-being of such an urban environment? And the tool that we currently have is a perspective which has been developed during the Quattrocento and a bit later. So here by Vignola, you see very nicely what at the lab we call the ideal observer on top. It's the architect. And here the inhabitant, and how the architect can actually, through linear perspective, can generate a shape, a form which is made or which can be embodied by this observer. And here you have, from a cognitive point of view, you have a first-person perspective. And here is something which is approaching a third-person perspective, which has an overview from the outside. In the theory of empathy in the 19th century, these two perspectives are fundamental. So we see in Wölflin's theory the reverberation of architectonic shape within the body. This is what has been referred to, what Bob referred to as architectonic simulation. And on the other hand, we have in Schmarzow's theory, which is a contemporary, we have a first-person perspective and the immersed observer within the space. You find all the texts translated by Mulgrave and commented by him. So if we go to science, we find models which are comparable. You have the embodied perspective by Mach, which is a perspective from within. And on the other hand, you have these multisensory spaces which are generated by the neurons, which are multisensory, bimodal or trimodal neurons that have been discovered also by Rizzolatti and his team a bit earlier than the mirror neurons. So these, there are like small spaces that are generated by these bimodal neurons, for instance, which are visual-tactile. So there is a bimodality. The same neuron is processing vision and is processing touch at the same time. I have a couple of examples for this. For instance, in the rubber hand illusion, you see that if you have a rubber hand in front of yourself that you see being stroked, and at the same time you're stroked on your real hand, after a while, you will start to integrate this rubber hand as if it was yours. You can easily do this experiment, just to continue the story with the hand. You can easily do this experiment with your neighbor and put together two hands and then, you know, feel the hand of your neighbor, so you get this alter experience of the other. So it's a part of the body which is alive but does not belong to you. It's something which evokes a very strange sensation. And it was suggested by Armel and Ramachandran that this could be done also with objects. So they have shown that you could do it also with objects, but it hasn't been reproduced. Another example is the out-of-body experience. This is the research of Olaf Blanke, the neuroscientist I'm working with, and you see that by stimulating the temporoparietal junction, it has been possible to evoke illusory states, so that you perceive yourself from a point outside of your body in space. You would see your own body. You would get this third-person perspective of yourself and this by stimulating this area in the brain and involving these multimodal neurons. The out-of-body experience was reproduced in the laboratory, and you can see that, like in the rubber hand illusion, the participant is stroked on the back and sees on a helmet head-mounted display, his own or her own body in front of him or her being stroked at the same time. So people are being asked afterwards, and they identify with the virtual body in front of themselves, and also they locate themselves at the place where they saw this virtual own body standing. It worked also with a virtual fake body, although we could not do the same experiment with a virtual object. We applied this full body illusion to two architectonic interiors in order to see how this multisensory space interacts with architecture, with architectonic elements. So for the large interior, the walls were located at visual distance, and we'll see later for the narrow interior, very close to the body. You see here on the screen what participants see. And actually for both spaces during this synchronous stroking that you feel on your back and you see here on the screen, so during synchrony, people were feeling contained. They had this sense that the walls were approaching them, that the space was getting smaller. The same thing for the narrow space, in which you see that the walls are very close, so they interfere with this peripersonal space, just the space surrounding the body. And here, actually, only induced by the walls, people were feeling touched. So independently from this full body illusion, people had this feeling of being touched by the walls, which on the other hand increased the capacity of people to do some estimations in the space. We made them estimate, this was one behavioral task, we made them estimate distances in the space, and the narrow condition actually during also the full body illusion improved the perception of the space. So seeing one body in front of themselves in the space increased the sensation of space. In this experiment, you have to take into account that you see the world from a disembodied point of view. So you have no body, and you see a body in front of yourself, so maybe it's easier to get transported into that body. In the next experiment, we did it actually with a power wall, so you get an embodied view for yourself. And we had the same effects of containment and of touch, this illusory touch, but in addition, people had the feeling that the space or the body was drifting towards them, and or that they were drifting towards the body. And this is a novel finding. It's a standard question in this kind of experiment, and the architectonic cue seems to be very powerful in inducing this kind of illusions together with these alterations of self-consciousness. So when doing the experiment without a body, all these illusory effects were not there. The only thing that people would perceive was this stroking within the space. So this synchrony, feeling the stroking and seeing a stroking instrument on the wall would produce that they would have this three-dimensional view of the same space. So now the question is, if with a wall you can induce these sensations or bodily feelings, what makes that we can perceive this mood or this character, these atmospheres? So what else does it take to recognize a space? And here, a very famous interior, actually, we are in the belly of the Statue of Liberty. Who would have thought that? So how is it possible that this interior or exterior condition can evoke such a completely different perception of a space? And to test shape, we further developed a paradigm for virtual reality, and using this cardiorespiratory pattern that is associated with basic emotions or interoception. Maybe some of you have seen in the posters, this poster that is showing embodiment through interior organs, using the kidney, for example. So the same kind of embodiment and spatial perception could be evoked through respiration or through the cardiac activity. So here you saw that the rubber hand illusion, and the hand was blinking in synchrony with the heartbeat of the subject. And you would have the same effect as when you were stroking the rubber hand. So it's like a very subconscious touch. People are not aware that they see their own heartbeat. And we transposed this experiment for the use of architecture into a mini cave. You have to imagine that people are pretty much wired. They have an ECG which is being taken, the headphones, and the tracking, the glasses. So you're still not free when you're standing in this, inside of this mini cave. What people saw in one condition were blobs. It was a room with blobs, which was blinking with their heartbeat. And actually in the next condition, they would see bodies blinking as a control condition. So I'll show you a little bit of statistics. What is very striking is that the heart rate was increased when the bodies were seen asynchronously to the heartbeat. So this seems to be something which is maybe displeasing or irritating. So people were maybe identifying during synchrony and not obviously during asynchrony. But you can see that for the blobs, it was the same. It didn't matter. Also, in the position tracking, you can see that for the blobs, it doesn't matter, we tracked the bodies. So when, of the participants, so when they saw the bodies blinking, there was a big difference between synchronous and asynchronous, while they would oscillate much more when they saw them synchronously. They were much more stable when they saw them asynchronously. And for the blobs, it didn't matter. It is a similar situation as with the bodies. So we could think from this data that certain shapes have by themselves the power to evoke certain emotions and certain sensations, something which is as concrete as a body needs to have this alteration of consciousness. So the blob in its own has this power to evoke what otherwise you need to evoke by stimulating this visual tactile dissociation. And we also asked people for their emotions. We asked several things, and apparently the blobs here, the ratings were quite high, but the blobs were a bit more comfortable. And the synchronous bodies actually induced fear. I mean, in general, fear was rated very low because maybe people just don't want to tell or do not externalize fear. What is interesting is now the first-person perspective. What we saw before is the perspective from science, the behavioral data. It's a third-person perspective. And this is a first-person perspective. What did people feel? We asked them questions. And you can see that here the shape was significant. And actually, in the asynchronous, people did not have the feeling of containment, which may be pleasant in an environment. So they did not feel this at all. And in general, you could see that the blobs were rated quite high when it comes to this touch illusion. So they were rather felt touched. Ratings are still low. But they had the feeling that the shapes were getting closer, and they were also having less, for instance, this illusory drift. So people were quite stable in the space. They had this stable impression of the space. I would like to conclude on this and to say that it is very well possible to manipulate the experience of space for one person, or to generate an intimate space, or to manipulate the space. But the challenge for architects based on that may be to understand how we can preserve architecture for another age of digital architecture, and how we can bring this cohabitation of space on another level. How can we use this knowledge, which is maybe now behavioral, but that can be further evolved into a neuroscientific discourse? How can this be used to generate spaces of coexistence and of monumental spaces that reflect values of our society? Thank you very much for listening. And